a lot of people talk about hunting a singular bed, and I think that's a big waste of time. Probably 95% of the time. Usually it's areas, and the area can be, from, in areas that don't have a lot of cover. It can be a quarter acre, but it could be as big as 5 acres, where that buck will have a tendency to bed at a certain time of year. And what I look for is anything that's going to tell me a time frame, like a bedding area that's really ripped up with rubs. I would say that they're probably bedding there close to pre-rut, when they're really worked up. Earlier in the season, they don't. And what'll fool people a lot is those bedding areas, those beds will have a lot of wear in them, look like they're used all the time. And they're really not. I think a deer laying there for a few hours does a lot of damage to the, and really makes a mark. So some of the things I look for, like there was a buck that I hunted for quite a few years in a big marsh, cattail marsh, where he lived in this cattail marsh. And he bedded in this cattail marsh, and it was pretty random. I mean, he had bedding areas, but a lot of them and a lot of spots he could be in, and it was all cattails. There's like 2 spots where I had trees I could hunt out of, and on the ground, the cattails are over your head. I have a hard time shooting, and I was really trying to find some way to kill this deer. He was the last year I hunted him, he was 7.5, and I kept going back, and it bothered me. There's got to be some way to get at this thing. And my big thing about scouting is to go in spring, right after the snow melts, and get in there while you can still see the sign from season and still read it fairly well. And that might not be as much an option down by you, Bronson. But anywho, I got back there and really searched one day, and I know the area intimately, but I came up to a spot that I had been to before but hadn't put it together. Let's say it's in this ocean of cattails that's for miles in the area where this buck is hanging, where I was getting trail cam pictures of him and such. And this spot, there's a little bit of elevation change. You couldn't see it on a topo. You couldn't even see it on an aerial, but there's like a foot higher of ground that came up out of the water in the cattails. And it was grassy, but it had willow brush on it that you really couldn't see from an aerial. It kind of blended in with the cattails. This willow brush was like like head high, and up here that stuff loses its leaves in early October. And in this willow brush was probably like 50 different beds that were worn to the ground. And all this willow brush was torn up, rubbed. And when I looked at that, I thought, this deer is not laying there in the sun, later in the year. He's laying there when that willow brush has cover. And, the rubs were really dull and faded. We're usually right after the season in January, February. If they were used, done in rut, our rut up here, they're still real orange, when the bark's stripped, telling me they're earlier season rubs. And you could see it was a yearly pattern. And I just assumed that buck had to be bedding there when our season opens in early September, between that, when they have antlers, which is early September, to when those leaves fell down, which is not that many weeks. And to put down that much bedding, in that time frame, he had to be there a lot during that time frame. So that's what I determined. And then what I did was I followed the exit trail from the bedding, which was one real heavy trail that it went up towards private land, and where it came up out of the cattails, there was a spot that was probably 20, 30 yards onto the public that had one tree about this big around that had some brush around it that you could get a stand about 8 or 10 feet off the ground. And I ended up, the first year I hunted that, the first time I hunted it, something got up in that bedding area and was coming to me, and a doe got up real close and came up to me and spooked. And then I left the place alone for the whole rest of the year, not wanting to spook the deer out. I think I gave it one more hunt, just in case. But it spooked the deer that was coming when the doe spooked, and I never saw it. The next year I went in there again, the first day of the season that we had the right wind, and I had the same thing, something get up in that red brush. You can't see it because the cattails are actually like 10 feet tall. and come in, and it turned out to be the buck I was hunting, and I shot him. And I've got an array of stories like that, but it gets you into the mindset of how I do that. But if a guy like finds those rubs and stuff and doesn't read it right and says, well, I'm saving that for rut, that deer's long gone. You know, you gotta get a timing thing down. And one thing I noticed too was like you had these roamer bucks, and that really hit home with me, because a lot of what I'm seeing is you'll see a buck that you hunt all season. He hops around in these bedding areas, and you'll have one that is in an area for like 2 weeks out of the season. He's gone. You never see him again the whole rest of the year, and you wonder what happened to him. And there's one deer in particular, a buck that was living on a private ranch that has managed hunts, but it took me a few years of hunting him, you know, where he'd come across the road, but it'd be after dark or whatever, and you kind of watch him. And right around pre-rut, about a week or so, he'd come over in daylight. But I saw a pattern over a 3-year period where he always ended up in the same bedding area right in that week, right around Halloween. And once I had that down and I figured that out, I shot the buck on Halloween day, the first time I hunted him. I waited till the sign showed up that he was there. And so it's not really this random hunting that people think, like you find a bed and you hunt over it. And I see a lot of young guys look at what I'm doing and think they can just go out and find a bed, and they'll send you a picture and be like, hey, I got it. I'm going to kill this buck this year. And it's like they don't even realize how much work and thought goes into that.
Yeah. That is excellent woodsmanship. I mean, I think focusing on those details like you described, that is really, really interesting. And it makes perfect sense to me. An example that you see here, I am pretty sure, if you notice that image in front of you, notice that there's some excursions, but notice that there's a higher density of bedding and movement on the north side of that graph. And then it kind of feathers out, and there's a lot more movement to the southern part of that graph. Do you see the border right there? There's this distinct line where that buck is not crossing.
Yep.
And that's a river. Mm. So he is nestled in kind of parallel in this region here, of course, adjacent to these rivers. That is where we're going to have cover. When you get more into the uplands, that's where we're going to have a patchwork of agriculture and fields and so forth. But then that is just an area right there that buck is concentrating a lot of his movements as well as a lot of his bedding. But if you, Dan, to your point, if you were just to sell out and find one of those beds, best of luck to you. I mean, you're probably going to strike out. It's going to take a lot of homework, not necessarily finding a bed, but if you zoom in there, you can see that there's clusters of those beds. And so definitely some tendencies for where that buck is hanging out. So it takes a lot of homework to figure that out.
And a lot of luck. I mean, it's like the skill and the luck have to collide for it to work.